All right, we're going to do something kind of wild today. We're going to unpack the entire global economy, but we're going to do it through the story of one single critical mineral, cobalt. We're going to use some slides here, inspired by an MBA course, to really dig into the hidden systems of power and capital. You know, the stuff that decides who gets rich from the resources that power our world and who gets left holding the bag.
Okay, so first up, the cobalt paradox. Let's dive right into the central mystery here, because at the very heart of this huge green energy revolution, there's this massive contradiction. It's all about the incredible wealth being created, and, more importantly, where all that money doesn't end up.
So I want you to just think for a second. What powers your phone, your laptop? What powers that electric car you see driving down the street? You got it. They're all powered by basically the same thing. It's a rechargeable battery, and every single one of them depends on one single critical mineral.
And here's the number that changes, well, everything. 70%. Just let that sink in. 70% of the entire world's supply of that mineral, we're talking about cobalt, comes from just one country.
And that country is the Democratic Republic of Congo. So here it is. This is the paradox that's going to drive our whole story today. How on earth can a nation that has a virtual monopoly on a mineral that is absolutely essential for our future, how can it be one of the poorest places on the planet? It just doesn't add up, right? Well, that is the question we are going to answer.
So, to solve this puzzle, we have to do two things. Yeah, we have to follow the mineral, but honestly, more importantly, we have to follow the money. We've got to see where the real value is actually created along this massive global supply chain.
So the whole journey kicks off right here with mining in the DRC. But that raw ore, it doesn't stick around. It gets shipped off to China for refining. Then, a lot of the time, it stays in Asia for the super high-tech part, making cathodes and battery cells. And only after all that does it get assembled into an EV somewhere else in the world. So you see, the DRC, it's just step one of a much bigger process.
And wow, this chart right here just brilliantly illustrates the whole problem. Just look at the insane jump in value at each stage. So a ton of raw ore right at the mine gate in the DRC is worth maybe $1,500, okay? Now, after it's refined, which happens mostly in China, that same ton of cobalt is suddenly worth around $30,000. And then by the time its value is measured as part of a finished battery cell, we're talking $200,000. The value multiplies by over 130 times after it leaves the DRC. That's just wild. So here's the absolute kicker, the most crucial point of all. After everything is said and done, the country that provides 70% of the world's most critical raw material for this industry earns just 1 to 2% of the final value in an EV battery. Let me say that again, 1 to 2%. Just let that sink in for a minute.
So you're probably asking, well, why can't the DRC just build its own refineries and keep more of that money? And that's the right question. But the barriers are they're immense. For starters, you've got a massive power deficit. A single refinery needs a ton of stable industrial-scale power that, frankly, just isn't there. Then there's the money. It costs over $500 million to build one of these things, and that kind of capital isn't exactly lying around. And finally, you're going up against China's incredibly integrated supply chain, where Chinese companies basically do it all. They finance the mines, they build the roads, and they process the ore themselves. It's a really tough spot to be in.
And look, this whole situation, it isn't unique to the DRC. Not at all. It's actually a classic pattern, one that's explained by a few key economic theories. You could call them traps that a lot of resource-rich nations seem to fall into. So let's take a quick look at how they actually work.
Okay, first up is something called the resource curse. It sounds weird, I know, but it's this paradox where having tons of natural wealth can actually make a country poorer in the long run. Why? Well, all that easy money often fuels corruption and conflict. Different groups start fighting to control the resource instead of, building a real, productive, diversified economy.
The second trap is called Dutch disease. Here's the play-by-play. You get a huge boom in something like cobalt exports, right? That floods the country with foreign cash. This makes the local currency way stronger. Now that might sound like a good thing, but it's a trap, because now everything else the country makes, we're talking farm goods, manufactured products, you name it, suddenly becomes super expensive and can't compete on the world market. So what happens? The rest of the economy just kind of withers away, and the whole nation becomes totally dependent on that one single super volatile commodity.
But here's the thing. This isn't destiny. It doesn't have to be this way. And what's so fascinating about this slide is the comparison with Botswana. Just like the DRC, Botswana's economy was built on a single resource, in their case, diamonds. But look at the outcome, completely different. While mining is over 95% of the DRC's exports, Botswana took its diamond money and intentionally used it to diversify its economy. They created a sovereign wealth fund to keep their currency stable. And here's the absolute key difference. Botswana built strong institutions before all that diamond money really started rolling in. It just goes to show you that a country's choices, not just its resources, are what really determine the final outcome.
Okay, so we've seen the economics of the trap. Now let's zoom out a bit. Because this whole story isn't just about supply chains and economics. It's about a massive global power struggle for the resources that are literally going to define the rest of this century. So, on one side of this chessboard, you have China. Their Belt and Road Initiative is this huge, long-term global strategy. We're talking over $170 billion invested in Africa alone. They're building the ports, the railways, the roads, all the infrastructure needed to secure these resource supply chains for their own industries. And a big part of their pitch is offering financing with no strings attached. That means they aren't making demands about democratic reforms, which, as you can imagine, is a pretty attractive deal for a lot of governments.
And now you have the West trying to play catch-up. The US and the EU are backing this big new project called the Battery Corridor in the DRC and its neighbor, Zambia. The stated goal here is to build up the capacity to process cobalt and copper right there in Africa. The whole point is to create a supply chain that doesn't depend on China. It is a direct geopolitical countermove, but the reality is they're starting about a decade behind.
Okay, all of this whole geopolitical game, it brings us to a really powerful way of thinking, a framework for understanding the incredible pressure these countries are under, because they are constantly being forced to make what feels like an impossible choice.
It's called Roderick's trilemma, and the theory is pretty simple, but it's brilliant. It says a country can have any two of these three things, but it can never have all three at the same time. The three things are: 1, deep economic integration with the world, global capital; 2, national sovereignty, the power to make your own rules; and 3, democratic politics, actually reflecting the will of the people. You always have to sacrifice one.
Let's make this real. We can see this trilemma in action with a really recent, really dramatic example out of Kenya. So, to get some crucial loans from the IMF, the Kenyan government passed a bill with some major tax hikes. In that moment, they chose two corners of the triangle. They picked deep economic integration by playing ball with the IMF, and they picked national sovereignty, the government's power to pass its own laws.
But then, the third corner of that trilemma fought back, and it fought back hard. A massive, youth-led Gen Z uprising just exploded onto the scene. Protesters who were feeling the real economic pain of those taxes and feeling like nobody was listening to them literally stormed the parliament. They were choosing the third option, democratic politics. They were demanding that their voices be heard over the demands of global finance.
And you know what? It worked. The government completely caved and withdrew the entire tax bill. Faced with that overwhelming public pressure, they were forced to sacrifice their economic integration with the IMF in order to keep the peace and be accountable to their people. I mean, the trilemma played out in real time, right there on the streets.
So this brings us right back to where we started, the DRC and its cobalt. To actually develop and move forward, what is it going to have to sacrifice? Will it give up its sovereign control to foreign powers just to get the capital it needs? Will it ignore the will of its own people to push through painful but maybe necessary reforms? Or will it sacrifice access to the entire global economy to try and forge its own path? According to this model, it can't have it all.
And that leaves us with this one final critical question. This new Western plan, this battery corridor, is it a real path to development for Africa? Is it a genuine industrial strategy that's finally going to help the DRC capture the value of its own incredible resources? Or is it just a geopolitical press release, a chess move in the great power game against China that ultimately leaves all the hard work and all those impossible choices right where they've always been?